try and focus it on a couple of themes that I think might be useful and provocative. I might say a couple of ground rules at the beginning. The first one is that there are no ground rules, so any comments along the way are welcome. I'll do some quick Q&A at the end of it, but Lord, if the group is small, we should just talk. So if something comes up, please wade in. With the exception of Carl and Hottie. They sit there quietly. Just to make them squirm. And I will occasionally use some facts, and I probably won't cite all the sources, but at the end of it, I'd be happy to explain where I got them. I'm going to use some slides, and the facts are not, the sources are not listed in some of the cases, just so you know that. I did want to say something about my work with John Wayne. It's hard to be a Duke and not think of John Wayne. Some of you may, everybody know who John Wayne is? I have to ask now. You all know who John Wayne is? Okay, good. Well, you know, not everybody does. Quite remarkable. I spent a year working for John Wayne as a wine steward on a yacht in the Mediterranean. Quite bizarre. And
when?
1963 or 64. At a time when John Sununu used to say there was probably the only Republican who ever didn't know enough to not like you or something like that. But John Wayne's nickname was Duke. And so when I walked on campus and suddenly saw the Duke sign, like had this image of the Duke. I might tell you just one anecdote about my work with the Duke, just because it'll give you some basis to judge the wisdom of the rest of my comments. I was working for some time in Spain building roads, and I hitched over to Lisbon and spent a couple of days on the waterfront trying to talk my way onto a small Portuguese fishing boats. Nobody would hire me. And then somebody said, you know, there's a big American yacht down the way and they're looking for somebody. Why don't you go see them? And then he said it was John Wayne's, and I said, oh, I'm going to get that job. I really want that one. And so I walked down and I talked to the captain, and this was a converted minesweeper, 146-foot boat that the Duke had converted into a little thing to sail around in, not sail, to motor around in. And I talked to the captain, and he hired me. I was on the boat just a couple of days, and I still hadn't met John Wayne. And the captain came along through the galley where I was, and he and Duke's brother, and he asked where somebody was, and I said, oh, I think he's downstairs in the basement. And I didn't know I'd said something wrong. The captain sort of looked at me and said, I'll see you later. And he came back and he said, now tell me about all this boating experience you've had. And I said, well, actually all I've ever done is all I've ever been on, literally, at that point in my life, was the canoes or the Staten Island ferry. And he said, I thought so. He said, I think I'm going to fire you. Not because you don't know much about boating, because we're not counting on you to run the ship, but I can't have someone working on the crew who lies to me. It's hard to argue with. He said, I'll think about it tonight, but I think you're gone in the morning. And I went to bed, and I was really bummed that I'd lost this great gig. I hadn't even met John Wayne, and it was over. And I came up to breakfast sort of nervously, and the captain was there with the crew. The crew always ate breakfast first. And I went over to the captain, I said, well, and he said, you are lucky. No kidding. Oh, wow. He said, well, I was talking to Duke last night, and I mentioned that we were going to have to fire you just after we hired you. And Duke says, tell me about this kid. I talked to the captain. I told him a little about you. Duke said, that's what I thought. This is one of those, I don't want you to fire this guy. I want you to change his job. I want him to work directly for me. Because this guy, meaning me, said the Duke, represents all that's worst in America. He's a guy with 2 Ivy League degrees, and he's one of these liberals who probably doesn't know squat about anything, but squat wasn't the word he used. And he said, so I want to see if this guy's as dumb as I think he is, and these guys are. And so for the next year, I proved him right. One error after another. But I did have the satisfaction, I kept up with them after we built a fairly nice tie, and I kept up with them. And at one point after I left City Hall, that Ed mentioned, I spent a year hosting a TV news program in New York, and I actually got John Wayne to come on public television for the first time he'd ever appeared on public television, which got me some points with my fellow journalists. So, enough about the Duke. I wanted to focus my comments on a very single theme, rather than just talk a lot about one foundation or one area of the country. I'm going to use examples from my New Hampshire work, but I want to talk specifically about what I think is one of my real disappointments in my times in the foundation world, and I think a major failure of foundations, and that's been the timidity of most foundations, and particularly their unwillingness to get involved. If you can't hear me, please, thank you, do that, because I sometimes speak quietly, so you can't tell me. And the timidity, and particularly the unwillingness of lots of foundations, too many of my peers, to get involved in public policy and to get involved in political fights. And it always seemed to me that we weren't using all our resources, and that the law allowed for a lot more involvement than most of us took advantage of, and that the country was losing something as a result. So I want to talk a bit about the experience in New Hampshire. And I think my experience is useful because, particularly because it wasn't as if this was a particularly liberal state in which I was involved in. I never changed my politics. But New Hampshire, throughout most of the time I was there, was quite a conservative state, with most of the governors during my time, starting with Milton Thompson, and John Sununu, and Steve Merrill, and Judd Gregg, and on, were fairly conservative Republicans. And the public policy work that I'm going to talk about was pretty liberal. Steve Merrill, in fact, one of the Republican governors I mentioned, who'd been Attorney General under John Sununu, that's John Sununu Sr., before he went to the White House to work as Chief of Staff for George Bush I. When I run into Steve Merrill, even now, if he's with strangers, he introduces me to them by saying, yeah, this is Lou Feldstein. He voted for my opponent when I ran, only because he couldn't find Karl Marx on the ballot. So it wasn't as if I did anything to hide my politics, but I want to tell you this by way of background to show, because I think it's possible, without either harming the foundation or its standing, and it's do quite a bit more. And so the topic for the talk I give today is what? Money is never. It's never the dollars. It's not the money. It's not the money. And I'm a little bit exaggerating, but I think that foundations have other kinds of clout, particularly community foundations, that enable us to do a lot more than foundations generally do. So let me just start by just making sure everybody knows where New Hampshire is. So we can start. I do this because I'm not sure everybody does know where we are. When I was in New Mexico 2 years ago, and I tried to rent a car, and I showed her my license plate and my driver's license, and the woman said, "No, we're only limited. We can only rent to people from the United States." And I said, "I'm from New Hampshire." She said, "That's Canada, right?" I said, "No, no, no." You know? So this is New England, just to start with the symbol, and here's New Hampshire, just so you know where we are. I think this group probably does, but I found out it's worth saying this. And this is New Hampshire itself, and I'm going to make some references to it. Those white lines are the counties. The interesting points about New Hampshire, remember Boston is down here, Maine's there, Vermont's there, Canada's up there. The Arctic Circle comes out something like around that. Those of you who are political junkies know that Dixville Notch is right there, where the first vote in the New Hampshire primary, which is the first primary in America, is held every year. That almost all the roads run east-west in New Hampshire. They don't go north-south because of the mountains. And maybe 75 to 80% of the people live in this circle here, radiating outward from Boston. Just a few demographic facts. New Hampshire went from, when I first moved there in the early 70s, it was a 26th wealthiest state. It's now the wealthiest state in America, God help us, in terms of measured by income of people. It is also voted year after year by these people that do these surveys the best place to live in America, for the best state to live in for the last 4 or 5 successive years. Unfortunately, that's a ballot that's heavily weighted by the absence of taxes. That's how the national rate is a way to do it. It's got the lowest crime, very low income. It's almost an entirely white state. It's maybe 90, 95, 96% white. It's only slowly changing. It is heavily Republican, as I said, it has been. Right now, the Tea Party won big in 2010, so that both houses are supermajority Republican. Just to give you an example, in 2008, when Obama was the head of the ticket, the Democrats won control of both houses and the State House for the first time since 1871. It's rare. And by 2010, 2 years later, this is good background so you'll understand what I'm dealing with up there. By 2010, the Senate shifted from 14 to 10 Democratic majority to 19 to 5 Republican, and the House went from a 62 Democratic majority to 197 Republican majority. We did retain the Democratic governor, who was the only governor to ever serve 4 terms, a very popular man. He takes no risks, but he's been quite popular. Maybe that's why. And he managed to retain his seat despite $2 million in national funds that went into the state just to unseat him because of his support of gay marriage. New Hampshire was the first state to vote gay marriage in the country by legislation, rather than by the governor's action, but he signed it.
What makes for the wealth? Is it
people
people
live
living along the Massachusetts line, or what's the source of, why is it the wealth?
Yes, it's Ted, it is the proximity to Boston and the wealth here. For 15 years, from 1980 to 95, this was the 4th or 5th fastest growing state of the country. Bizarre. In part that reflects because it's a low denominator, so you add one family, it puts the numbers way up. But also because a lot of people were moving up from Massachusetts and Connecticut. When they moved across the border, they could still work in Boston down here, but living right here.
And that income made in Boston counts in New Hampshire?
Yes, it's where they live, where they pay their taxes. And of course,
There's
they pay
also
their taxes in...
There's also a huge amount of rural poverty.
What?
There's a lot of rural poverty.
There is a lot of rural poverty way up in here and some along the Connecticut, right next to you, but it's not a lot. Relatively, it's still a state with very low percentage of poverty. And then what makes it the high wealth number is less the presence of many high wealth, multimillionaires, and more the absence of a lot of poor people. There's certainly some. In fact, the state also scores very high on the children, what's the Casey survey, children?
Kid count.
Kids count, thank you. Kids count. New Hampshire scores first in the state, all the states in kids count. It's the healthiest state. First year they came out and everybody was cheering, and I did a press conference pointing out that there were a lot of problems, including poor kids in poverty, and the governor called me up and said, why can't you just behave? You know, why do you have to find the hole in the donut? Everybody says we're good, and you have to point out what's not there. That was the job as a foundation head. But basically, the numbers are good, and there aren't many poor people. Let me take a moment before I go any further just to explain for those of you. Does everybody know what a community foundation is? Can I skip it? Should I take a moment and say, community foundations are a little bit odd. There are over 100,000 foundations in the country, of which about only 700 of them are so-called community foundations. The difference is that the money comes not from a single donor, but from multiple donors. It continues to come. The foundation serves a defined geographical area. In this case, it serves a full state, the one I ran, but most of them serve cities. The largest community foundation here is the Foundation for the Carolinas, but there's a big one in Greensboro, Winston-Salem. Those are the 3 biggest in the state, community foundations. they're distinguished also because the money doesn't come from a single family or a single individual. This matters when you get to public policy. The governing board of the Community Foundation, under the IRS terms, is not from a single family, but represents the entire state. And it's a nonprofit board. And therefore, we have somewhat more latitude to lobby and to be involved in public policy than a private foundation does. But that's not the reason why our peers couldn't do more. That's not the only reason. But we are able to do somewhat more because we're a little less regulated. And this foundation serves the entire state. So let me just move on a bit. I'll show you one more chart just because this shows you part of, I'll get into it later, how we do our public policy. The state, because it's New Hampshire, live free or die, all the power is local. It has the weakest executive of any state in the country. And this isn't a comment on Judd Gregg or John Lynch or anybody who's there. The structure is weak. All the power is in the local community, not even counties. It's a very weak county system. The power is in the 233 towns, what the Agriculture Commissioner calls 230 sugar bush republics. That's where all the power sits. And so to do anything with capital is much more difficult. So one of the early responses we've done, which has been critical to the public policy work we do, is to build regional divisions. I'm going to gradually paint a picture of how to do public policy in the state. And we built each of these regional divisions. You don't have to know the names of them, but in the North Country, Piscataqua, and so forth. And under each one as the year was built. But it allows us to create a board at that level and to reach down to build a constituency, because statewide we couldn't move people that quickly. So we went to this as a way to mobilize people at the community level. So from the beginning it was a political decision. It was also a decision as a way to raise more money. Community foundations are distinguished, unlike private foundations who get often their big gift one time from the family. People continue to give to community foundations, and you're constantly adding donors, and you're constantly trying to attract funds. It's also why many people say community foundations can never take risks politically, because if you do that, you might offend someone who will never give you their money. And I'm here to say that doesn't happen. You can do it, take risks, and people will continue. We continue in New Hampshire to be one of the 25 or 28 largest community foundations in the country. New York, Chicago, LA, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Cleveland, and New Hampshire, the usual crowd. So we've been able to draw people with this base of 1.3 million people, equivalent to or better than much larger foundations, even though we were very political. So let me now get to talking about what I mean by being political and how we did it. And I think this next chart is probably as useful as any single thing I'm going to show you. Let me stand up. This complicated chart tells a lot about it. To begin with, of course, top opportunities, and you see 3 arrows showing the kinds of opportunities you face at the Community Foundation. Responsive grants are by far the largest, of course, activity. And you'll notice, let me go back over here first, capital. This makes clear that there is more than one kind of capital that you can invest, clout. Money is the one that most foundations invest most heavily. That's what you hear about. And that was why I picked my title, that money is never the answer. So a bigger portion of our money goes into what we call responsive grants than either of these 2 others. Then there's time, and time means time of senior management in your board, which is a resource. Spend it. And then there's influence, clout, social capital. And what you see here is that on the grant program, the bulk of our money goes here. But when you get over civic leadership, which we call it civic leadership because we found out early on that you can never use safely the word advocacy or public policy. It scares the hell out of a lot of people. You can probably use the word with the door closed here. But publicly, when you talk about doing public policy and advocacy, some people immediately think it's illegal. Some people think it's immoral. Some people think it's that's not what God created foundations for. Leave that to someone else. People who are donors say, we give to charity because we don't want to get involved in all that stuff. Don't tell me about public policy and advocacy. You're going to compromise the foundation. You're going to ruin my name and reputation. So one of the lessons when I get to the end is we never use the term public policy, and we never use the term advocacy. because it always scares somebody. And they don't tell you it scares you. Sometimes they just disappear. Say, I don't want to be part of that place. So we have this really banal, vanilla term, civic leadership, a real bumper sticker. You know, who cares? But that's the category that I'm going to focus on today. And I'm going to focus on, and you'll see that under that, we put some money into civic leadership there. But the bulk of what we put in there is not money. It's time and it's cost. It's investing the connections, the political connections that we have. So when I go on further and talk about who's on the board, how you pick a board, what you expect them to do, it's cashing in on their clout and connections. It's trying to move a political agenda. I should also acknowledge before you say it to me, it's much easier to do this in a small state like New Hampshire with 1.3 million people than it would be to do it in a state of this size, let alone New York or California or Texas. But it is still possible to do that. And at the bottom you see this line that goes from responsive to intentional. Here we're just responding to what comes in over the threshold, which is what most foundations do, and then they set priorities and try to spend on those. But as we move out here towards the political side, it's much more intentional. And a lot of what I want to focus on is how you do that, how we make the choices, the intentional part of it. So there's a lot in there, but what can I say that, what hits you when you look at this? Does it make sense? What do you think? What's not clear? What's implicit that I skipped over?
What's the community partnerships?
Good question. Those are invariably, when foundations get more active, they usually moving towards the right, towards more intentional, towards partnerships which often involve convening or collaborating where you're working with someone else. It may be that the group is coming together to talk about a public policy issue, but it may not be that they've gone as far as lobbying, but it's a partnership. Sometimes the partnership is on funding something with other people, but it stops short of working the legislative halls. Please.
Are you, this chart referring to the discretionary funds of the foundation versus the donor advised, or is
Good
it
question.
all sort of?
That's a great question. I didn't say, thank you, Barry. The funds of a community foundation are of many types. The donor can give you the money and say it's discretionary, do what you want with it, but the bulk of the funds that come in are restricted. Some of them are restricted to a single agency, which you have no control over. You're just a fiscal agent on those. Some of them are scholarships, the same way, no control. But some of them are so-called donor-advised funds, where the donor retains the right to advise where the money is going. But it's only advice under the IRS terms. The final decision must be made by the board. In practice, the donor tells you and you do it. But you can go to the donor upstream and say, hey, would you support this out of your donor-advised funds? And many of them are willing to do it. So you can enlist donors in doing this work, and even though they retain the right to advise, you can persuade them often to advise, to do it where you want to do it on political issues. And in fact, some of my peers complain, it means you have to do the work twice. You persuade them to give you the money, then you got to go back and persuade them again where it goes. On the other hand, it gives you a chance to go see them again. So it's not all bad.
Do you use the phrase political issues when you're talking
To donors? Depends
Political,
on who the donor is.
political issues.
Yeah, only.
Political.
Yeah, and that's the right question, honey. Only with some donors. But if it's one where we're going to the legislature, we can't disguise that. Some of them, as you can imagine, are fought out on the rules and regulations. The executive is going to use. Some of them are going upstream to federal issues. So you don't always have to use it, but sometimes. And some donors, of course, welcome it. Over time, their tolerance builds. In the beginning, people are scared, a lot of them, and you have to keep trying to build comfort with them. Early in my career, I didn't know any better, and I went to see John Sununu when he was the governor to present my credentials and to tell him that I was taking over the foundation. I said, and I wanted you to know, Governor, that we're going to be involved, well, I know it's in public policy, and I'm not anxious to pick a fight with you. I'm hoping we can find some issues we can work together on. And John Sununu looked at me and said, Feldstein, I know all about your liberal background in Mississippi and then with John Lindsay in New York. If you're as smart as everyone tells me, within 10 minutes you know that I'm right and you're wrong. Otherwise, it'll take me a month. Those of you who John Sununu, that's a quintessential John Sununu comment. And then, I still a bit slow to pick up. I got in a fight within my first 6 months with Sununu, or first year over some funds which he accused me of trying to influence the legislature on. And he went around the state making speeches. He made 4 or 5 speeches in which he referred to this new guy running the foundation. He's a New Yorker. He doesn't understand how New Hampshire works. He kept calling me a pushy New Yorker. And I remember calling my board chairman up and say, "Are you listening to that? That's anti-Semitic. That's a code." And there's a long silence. And then my board chairman said, "Well, you are a pushy New Yorker." A. And B, he said, "You can't take on John Sununu. You're not ready. You may be someday, but you're nowhere near it. So you've got to climb down, get out of that fight, and find some graceful way. Otherwise, you're not going to last very long." You know, it's like I was learning pretty quickly. And in the end, within a few months, I had the ignominy of having to go over to the executive corner office, my second visit there, having been there the first time to introduce myself, with my board chairman and the vice chair. And I was supposed to say, literally, I sat there for 45 minutes while John Sununu lectured me, and I kept saying, "Yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir." And that was what the board chairman said, "You better do. You better find another way. This is not the way to win this issue, and it's going to ruin it for the foundation." These stories don't usually tell publicly in the press and all that, but that was one way of learning it. And again, it's possible in a small state. It may not have been in one like this. It's also to say you don't win these things right away. You make some big mistakes.
Look,
Yes.
I don't see build capacity in this chart, particularly at the state level. And my impression is you spent a lot of your career building the capacity to do these things. So where does that fit?
That's a good question, and it would, since we're building it both in the nonprofit sector and in the government state agencies, it would fit in each of the 3 across the top. We didn't list it. It's really a nice point. A lot of the work we do is to build the capacity.
Yeah.
And a lot of the work you do with building capacity has to do with being able to do political work downstream.
Right.
Because you build up some chips.
Yeah.
You help people and you build connections before the fight starts.
Yeah.
Then when you go back, then you've already...
So it's one off.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Other questions, comments? Okay. So,
Well, you'll get to this. What was your pot when you got there? What's your pot then? Having established yourself as a crazy liberal, how big is your
we were 25 million when I started. That was the year they celebrated 25 million, and they were 510 million when I left. So we grew in spite of, and that's, I'm not taking credit for that. I'm simply saying we could grow and do this and not lose the connections. And we continue to do that. So let me just give you a couple of examples of the kinds of things we did. And I want to go back, God bless you, to the first. I want to go back to the very beginning because I want to use just a couple of quick case studies to illustrate how this works and what we learned in the process. I described to you my early venture and a failure, which was trying to influence the legislature. I did successfully persuade the Senate to move some funds that the governor wanted for his own. It was not a very smart thing to do. I then made this even stupider mistake of talking publicly about the need to change the state's tax code, which in New Hampshire is every governor for the last, since 1950-something, has so-called taken a pledge which says, "I will veto any income tax." We're the only state without an income tax or a sales tax. And I made some speeches about that, and in effect, I was just ignorant. It wasn't the way to proceed, and I was premature. And so we pulled back, I pulled back the things we were doing. And then I ended up instead taking on a very different venture. And I want to show you some. This is an effort. Let's see. Okay, this is something called the Trust for New Hampshire's Lands. And this is early 1980s, trying to persuade the state to do something about protecting lands because the population growth was so rapid in the state. It was, as I said, one of the fastest growing states in the country. And we had phenomenal success. This was one in which I worked as a partner with John Sununu, in which we went to the legislature together. I was one of the 2 or 3 key speakers for this idea. And the idea was simply that we would try and double all the land protected in the state in a 5-year period. We would double all the land that had been protected in the previous 200 plus years in the state. And we would do it in a two-step process. First, we would raise privately all the money to negotiate with landowners or towns to protect land, and then we'd raise public funds to actually acquire the development rights to all those lands. And we succeeded in 4.5 years in doubling the land. We did several things that made it right. Each one of these numbers is a different property we acquired. We made a point of acquiring land all over the state in very small parcels, so we picked up political points rather than acquiring big parcels. Because to win it, we had to get something in everybody's district. It's a little bit like earmarks. You know, we were doing it in a way that brought a lot of people in all across the state. And it was terrifically successful. And the same donors and people that were horrified at what I'd been doing before and said, don't go into public politics, what are you doing, you're crazy to do it. Those people loved this. It was every bit as much. I was testifying before the legislature, I was lobbying the legislature for funding. We worked, but the difference was, the Yankees, my neighbors, they don't care much about people, but they love the land. So we were involved in land protection. Oh, that was great. So the same people that said, don't speak, don't get involved in legislation, how dare you testify, we've never done that, they thought it was great that I was up there testifying in behalf of this. And I wanted to say, hey, you dummies, it's the same thing I did before. But I was the dummy. It took me a while to realize that picking the issue made a real difference, and getting into this would make a real difference. And so that's what I learned. So here's the results. In 5 years, we added, you can read this as quickly as I can. We purposely covered not only geographically everything, but we wanted to cover working farms and everything we could do. We even covered some ocean sites. This is the one little piece of ocean frontier. We even covered some ocean front. Anything we could do to pick up political points, to shield it. And we doubled the total protected land thing. And it was phenomenally successful, and it still is. So you see we covered all but 30 of the towns got land protected in it. There's the real bottom line, though. Whatever happened to the state, for us, it was a huge win because we had successfully partnered with the state, won a big victory, something we'd never done before. The legislature got used to seeing us come in and out the door all the time. They all loved the idea. And it was a terrific plus that at least got me back to ground zero. After 2 years to go, after 5 years to get back to ground zero, felt like progress.
Your board had a lot of patience. And I mean that very seriously. We've been through similar stories and stuff, but you know, your board could have said, take a hike, and stuck with you. Why?
It was discussed. So it wasn't as if it didn't come up. But the board saw that I realized I'd made a mistake by rushing too fast. We were all learning about how to do this. And we were learning together, and it was very open. We made a series of decisions on how the board worked that's turned out to be incredibly helpful. Let me just jump in and say what they were. We decided to gradually change the composition of the board from people who knew very wealthy people to people who were in the game politically, but not elected officials, but people who had standing with both sides. So we now, for example, have had, when I left, the first woman Republican Speaker of the House, who had been Speaker for 8 years, the most recent Democratic Attorney General, when he stepped down after 6 years in the office. They were all still visible icons in their parties. They were still visible as players, and they had the capacity to at least conceivably work with the other party. Second, we went to meeting monthly, 3 hours at each meeting, and we went to having no working committees. The reason we did that is we had to build enough comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, not E-D-Y, among the board so that R's and D's would cross the line and vote together. You couldn't do that if you only met 3 times a year. So we consciously, intentionally invested in people seeing one another regularly. And that's why we did away with committees too. Now, again, that's a big ask for people because we asked the most important people in the state in many cases, but we asked them to meet regularly. And the goal was clearly we had to build enough trust so that this Republican Speaker would occasionally give up her views and vote with the Democratic Attorney General, which is like that. Yes, please.
And did the board know and intentionally recruit somebody who would take them into the public policy arena? Or did they find that they just had you and were convinced over time that actually this is the route to go? And if it's the latter, what was the sequence of activities that moved you from the safe kind of environmental area to the less comfortable or more contentious people issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did say something about this when I was interviewed. I made no bones about it. At the time, I was looking at another job where the head of the search committee was a woman named Hillary Clinton. And it was the New World Foundation in New York, and I ended up with the option of the two of them, but I would rather stay in New Hampshire and do this. But it didn't happen, and I didn't hide it. But I don't think I really emphasized it. I don't think they understood what I had in mind. And I think they figured, well, this guy's going to be a little uncomfortable, but he brings some good energy, and let's try it. So I think that they started somewhat predisposed. And again, the personal connection, in a small state, the chances were higher that they could get to know each other. The chances were much better than I could have done in a place where I was totally cold to them. And there were some that continued to be uncomfortable. Of course, it was term, so gradually some people left the board, and we recruited. And we gradually did recruit increasingly for people who were politically smart, even if they weren't in parties. And so now, in the latter years, when I would come to the board with an issue, it was never one of describing what the issue was. As soon as I started talking about it, I could see people at the table were running their own calculus. Where's the governor? Where's the speaker? Where's the Senate president? Who do we have to move on this one? They knew it ahead of me. Not everything, but they knew enough about it that you ended up with a team of people who were right there. Second, on most of these issues, the board members, as individual board members, became important players. They did the lobbying. I did it too. In my last 8 years or so, I was registered as a lobbyist. I bet there aren't 10 foundation presidents in America registered as a full-time lobbyist. And I did it on purpose. The law encouraged me to do it, but I didn't have to do it. But I did it because I wanted to norm the term, and I had enough standing to do it. And I used to wear my lobbyist badge to the annual meeting, so there'd be 1,000 people out there, and I'd say, that orange thing here, that's not a color statement. You know, I'm a bad dresser, but it's not because of the color. That's my lobbyist badge for the state. I want you to know I'm a lobbyist. And I'm functioning as a lobbyist, and explain to people why we were doing it. But by that point, we had progressed considerably down the line. But in the early stages, as I said, we had not. And we did all these exercises to build trust among the board. And that's why we did away with committees, because we didn't want something done where people didn't see one another. But those are big asks to make of people. On the other hand, the results were pretty clear. People began to see them. I want to show you a couple of less pleasant examples to show that all these public projects don't work well. So we did try restructuring the state's tax system. This was, again, having failed the first time, came back again about when John Sununu was in Washington and tried it again. I figured he was going, I could try it. We didn't try it directly, but we supported a finance committee in the state legislature to hire McKinsey and Company to do some studies that led to, it seemed pretty safe. They hired McKinsey for the state finance committee, and they had a Republican majority on it. So about 2 months after we did that, I get a call from a friend in Washington who I also knew was close to John Sununu, who thought just make a conversation. And then in the middle of it, he said, you know, I hear the IRS is thinking of auditing you all. And I was like, oh, God, it's the last thing we want. And I knew we'd do nothing illegal, but I knew also what it meant. And at that time, there was a reporter who you knew, David Burnham, who had written this book called about the political use of audits. And David was a friend. And so I knew this was all in the news a lot. And so when I got off the phone with this person, the source, who was actually not a source, they were warning me, in effect, to drop it without ever saying that they were calling on behalf of Sununu. I called David. I said, David, and I described the situation to him, and I said, is this a politically, is this an audit? He says, oh, it's perfect. It's a classic. I said, well, what can I do about it? There was a long silence, and he said, I have an idea, but I want to think about it for 24 hours before I even give you my idea. So like, next day, 24 hours later, I called David back and said, all right, here's the idea. You can use this, but, and I'll tell you what the but was in a moment. He said, you can leak to this person that I'm going on your board. He said, now, he had just done the Ted Koppel show with the head of the IRS about his book, and afterwards they went out to dinner with the head of the IRS, David and his wife and the head of the IRS, and she said, are you going to audit David? And the head of the IRS looked at David, looked at him and said, looked at her and said, are you kidding? If any one of my agents ever mentions David Burnham and audit in the same sentence, they get sent to Guam. You know, we don't want to touch that issue. You know, it's crazy, but it's politically touch it. So he said, so I don't think there's a chance if I'm going on your board, they'll audit you. But he said, if the issue doesn't disappear, I have no interest in being on your board, but they don't have to know that. So you can use it. So I called the person back, you know, a day later, and talked a little bit more, and just mentioned, well, I said it'd be interesting, because, you know, David Burnham's coming on the board, and he's reading the book, and there was silence on the other end, and the issue never came up. So I don't know if that's what killed it or not. But it was probably, we also dropped the issue. We didn't go any further on it. We decided it wasn't worth it to take that kind of heat. So I'm going to skip past this next one, which is, this is why we got involved in the tax issue, was the deficit. Because we couldn't do anything unless we solved the state's budget problems. And you all know the phrase, if we could do something on the budget, it seemed like we really had a shot at it. This is another way to put it. Anyway, I'm going to leave this and skip this. These are some more issues we picked, but just to show you how these things come up. Issues you don't think are even tough. We got involved in trying to reduce teenage drinking. Now that seems pretty safe, right? You're not satisfied, girl. So it seemed pretty safe, and these are what we're proposing to do, increasing the penalty and so forth. Well, about a month after we got involved in the campaign to do this, this was one of, we went, over time we had 14 bills successfully approved to try and reduce drinking in the state. But this was an early effort, and within a month after doing it, we found that our real opposition was not coming from liquor sales directly. The people involved in sales had gone directly to the retail grocers in the state and to the hospitality industry. And they basically said the Charitable Foundation is trying to do this. This bill is going to cut tourism substantially in Hampshire. It's going to cut jobs. And they were very smart. They didn't go to the person who was on our board or anything like that. They went to the partner they were dealing with. They said, if so-and-so, who's your partner, who's on the board, supports this, or if you don't get to so-and-so, we're going to find another attorney. And so we had all the law firms in the state saying, you got to drop this. And pressure coming from, we couldn't tell where it was coming from or why, but they had successfully, they were way ahead of us. We had never seen the second and tertiary consequences and realized where the opposition came from. Eventually, we got a modified portion form the bill passed, but it was much softened. And it was a lesson that these kind of pressures come from ways which you can't see right away. I'm going to take this next one as another example where we didn't see the opposition coming. Social capital impact statement. People know the term social capital at all. So this is stuff, I've done a lot of work with a guy named Robert Putnam. We did a book together and stuff like that. I continue to work closely with Bob, who wrote a book called Bowling Alone, which simply says that the social connections in your life in a community have real dollar value. Nothing very sophisticated about that. You can actually assign a dollar value to a Rolodex based on who people know, and that the health of a community is determined considerably by the amount of comity and trust among the community and relationships and so forth. And that Putnam has connected that directly and successfully with everything from education level to police protection and so forth. And we simply argue that in addition to the environmental impact statement on big federal improvements, the government ought to consider an environmental impact. I'll give you a simple example. When a small post office closes in a rural area, they're required by law, as you know, to hold a public hearing. And you've probably seen these pictures. They see them now because they're closing 3,400 post offices. People in a small town say, please don't close it. We've lost our gas station, we've lost our market, We've lost everything else. All we have in our town as a public facility is the post office. It's where we meet. It holds our community together. If you close that, it will destroy what's left of our community. And the people conducting the hearing would say, we are not allowed to consider that. The terms we can look at under the post office legislation refer specifically to the cost of living, the mail, and so forth. You may be right about destroying your community. That's not something we're allowed to look at. So we argued to the post office department, you ought to build a social capital impact statement. And we enlisted other foundations around the country to try and make this case and try to win the case. And we did it in 2 different places. We tried to do it in the widening of the state highway and in the efforts to build a prison in the poorest part of the state. And just for example, in this effort, the people in the community ended up having to choose between whether they got the job through the prison or what it might do to the community to have a prison in the middle of it in terms of a lot of outsiders coming in and so forth. And in the end, those people turned against us to a person. They said, we don't care about the larger principle. We want the jobs in our community. Drop that issue. And I use these only as examples to say it comes up again and again. The same thing happened trying to block gambling. You don't win every issue. And we got burned on a bunch of them. I don't want to make it simple, and I could go through more detail, but they're ugly. So these are, I'm just going to show you these quickly. These are a whole series of different projects that we did in public policy. Almost all of them involved legislation. There were some where we even went against and reversed Democratic governors on vetoes and things like that. So we were willing to go against both sides. And this is, just to give you a long, long list, this is only a sampling, as that little twist says. We did many, many more, but many of these were efforts that involved legislation, state, public funding, and over a 20, 25-year period. I could list many more. But when I started to list the governors down the side, how many years we worked on these. The point is only to give you a flavor of what could be done. And in almost none of these did money matter. We rarely spent much money on these projects. But we spent huge amounts of my time as the CEO, huge amounts of board time, and huge amounts of the top management. Because the way to do this stuff, it's so volatile, so explosive, so risky, as I tried to illustrate before, that it's got to involve the top of the organization. It's not something you decentralize all the way down. And so the real constraint is not money. The real constraint is staff and leadership time. And we were never constrained by money, nor did we put much money into these. Some of these were worth tens of millions of dollars, but we didn't have enough money to do that, with one exception on the money, and that is the money got us in the game because people perceived us as having money. So you know that people play poker, you know jacks are betted open. That's in poker, there's some games we have to have jacks in. We were in the game because we had jacks. We had a pair of jacks. So people said, they got money. They must know what they're doing. They're going to spend it. People over-exaggerate what foundations have by way of money. They think we have a lot more than we do. We certainly didn't. But we got in the game because we had money. That was the jacks are better. But after that first hand, once we were in, we were all bluffing. It's all blue smoke and mirrors. We're playing entirely with contacts, connections, and information, and not with money. And I say that because it means much smaller foundations can also be players. It's not limited to big foundations. And more of our okay.
But Lou, I'd like to make a comment about that. And I think you probably agree that in the experience I've had with community foundations people, that perspective is less than 5% of that held by the number of people who run community foundations. The idea that you're going to really mix it up with the senior players in the legislature and everything else frightens people in the philanthropy world more than. I'll give you one example. I was giving a talk in Connecticut, and there must have been 250 people there from representing foundations, individual big givers, or heads of foundations and so forth. And We were talking a little bit about what you're talking about. So I said, let's do a quick question. How many of you have been to a cocktail party or dinner with your local councilman or selectman or whatever it was in the last 6 months? And there might have been 5 hands that went up. And so obviously you ask the question, well, why not get to know these people? They are worth getting to know. And the answer was, we're not supposed to do that. We don't want to do that. And they'd have kids go to the same school, blah, 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 blah. But when it came to breaking bread with a political person, it was like a serious war was going on. So you know, we know each other quite well, but I'm just astounded every time I hear stories like this, how you're able over time to break through that wall and make it legitimate that you can be across the table from, you know, Herman, who is one of the local owner of the of the 5 and 9 store, and really go at it. It's just quite surprising, and I can't say anything more except all of my experience goes in the other direction, and probably a lot of yours too.
I don't understand, but I would ask you all, why does it happen? Why do people in philanthropy, which is the safest, you know, it's permanently endowed, there's no need to go back to the public for approval, the law allows lots of this, you couldn't be safer. If you had to pick one institution in America that was really inoculated, that's what's so discouraging about it, and I don't know. I don't have an answer as to why it's so hard to move people.
Look at the composition of your boards. Think about how it is they understand the levers of power are exercised and to what arenas you do that. And understand that for most of them, there's nothing quite as grubby as the political world, and nothing as efficient as the use of power coming out of their economic and other standards, in which it can be done in a club over here as opposed to in a public arena over here. And finally, of course, the average person that I know on foundation boards does not come on foundation boards because they believe in the kind of social activism that some of which you're talking about. They just don't. I mean, money does not create social activism.
Absolutely.
And money is what dictates most board memberships.
I think when you use the word grubby, I think that's part of people just think
Well,
it's unseemly.
politics are dirty and philanthropy is genteel.
Just the word.
I have to ask something. Your population has grown. A lot of it is clearly from out of state, now New Hampshire people. Your legislature and your governors are elected from what population pool? I mean, do the newcomers participate in the politics of New Hampshire in that sense of running for office, or do they see their lives being over there in Massachusetts and they come home to their undertaxed lives in New Hampshire? I mean, what do they play the political game in New Hampshire?
Yes, I think they do. I think the numbers show that for people moving into a community, which we know something about, that it usually takes a while to get involved, and they do look back, as you say, to their home communities. But still, a surprisingly high percentage do get involved because they get involved because their neighbors pull them in. So that's helped us actually. It's generally made the state somewhat more liberal because the people coming in are both better educated and wealthier than the people who were there before. Each group's it's still that way. Even the immigrants that come into the state are a higher educated and wealthier group of immigrants than the immigrants generally in this country. Everything about it in New Hampshire made it really genteel, so we've drawn people that be players. But that's the key issue as to why more in the field don't do it, and I think both of your comments go.
Got a lot of good points on that.
But let me go back to something though.
I also
They knew who you were when they hired you, right?
yeah,
I mean,
but I hadn't been this active.
Hmm?
But I didn't hide it.
Well, you hadn't been inactive,
Right.
at least by my standards. I'm just interested that they hired
Please, Ted.
You may be getting to this, but this sort of grows out of this discussion. How do you go about what's the discussion that goes on in setting your priorities? And are these board members actively involved in doing this? Is it tend to be staff-driven or?
Yeah, let me just show you what the criteria are that we use, that they're using there now. It's not a bad set. These are what they're doing now. This is how we track it. So these are nothing very striking. At some level, these are the kinds of questions the board is looking at.
None of those are New Hampshire questions.
No, that's right.
Are there New Hampshire questions?
Well, the answer is always low. That's a great question. I'm going to go back a step up. A lot of people say that may work in New Hampshire, but it'll never work in Peoria, where I am. But that's never true. Because you see a CEO change hands in a community, in a foundation, and suddenly the foundation's doing something they never did before. But it doesn't mean you still don't have to find the local language and find the local roots to it. So every one of these has to be answered in New Hampshire terms.
Okay.
Yes, it's not a generic answer. But I don't believe when people say you can't do it somewhere else. And that's why our example is useful, because it is such a conservative state, and yet they were able to do things that wouldn't be done elsewhere. I mean, and it also goes to your point about people say it's not proper, but people do it. It's possible. And part of it also is probably needing to recruit for the lead job someone who wants to do that. And that may be the hard part, because you have to go upstream to the board to get a board willing to say that's what we look for. If a person comes in who's not been in the game or cared about politics, then she or he is not likely to learn it. And you could successfully go through a full term at a foundation, as many people do, and never go near this stuff, and nobody would criticize you. So it's only when the board has to make a choice to hire someone unlike who they might ordinarily have hired, and for some of the reasons you're talking about, the people on the board are not likely to look for someone like that. And the search firms don't bring them that, because the search firms know what kind of person they want. So it's a hard cycle to break. And this is a better answer that you can break it, but it doesn't say how to change the system. But we're losing something in the country. And when foundations just put their money into it and don't think about the other parts, they lose something. Ted, you have a follow-up?
But where do the ideas come from that are then measured by this template, and how does the measuring go on? What's the process, the discussion process that goes on?
In the board.
Well, does it happen in the board? Does it happen in the staff?
No, the staff,
Reporting then to the board, or?
all these, we don't go into a big policy issue without the board being part of it from the very beginning, from early on, because they need to own it, and because they're smarter than we are in a lot of the politics of it. And we won't have a chance of holding them with us unless we bring them in early. I keep saying we, but it's the same, it works the same way now. So they were in from the very beginning. They owned it. It wasn't something to say, we're going to do this, yes or no.
But might they bring the idea in the first place?
Yes, often. They'll be in conversations on these things because they're part of it, and they say, can we do something on this? They were always the first.
The brothers Knight were not dumb people. They were very smart people. And among the things that they were smart enough to know, the staff tends to play the hidden hand game as much as possible. And suddenly the board is being talked into doing things they never thought about doing by staff, which is why they were so much against large staff at night for so long. I'm not making anything as a statement of fact. That's the way they went. So now being a Senate, I have a little difficulty believing that you guys on the staff don't do a hell of a lot of moving of the hands of what you're going to pick and choose from, that your board is going to be a part of it.
Yes.
Just going more directly to that question, how much of this stuff bubbles up from the board, and how much of it's bubbled over to the board?
More the latter, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we wouldn't get very far if we
Yeah.
lost the board
Yeah,
because so because they're smarter than we are on this stuff, and so they would, and because we need them to make calls, and so usually early on in the process we'll have individual board members before we've decided making calls to the governor, the speaker, the majority leader, whatever, testing on something if we're going to do it, or testing key lobbyists or someone. Do we have a shot at this?
For the handful of people in here who don't know anything about it, this is the most stunning description from a foundation acting like no foundation acts, being this overtly political. It is incredible. And it's just, I love it. Yes, but it's incredible.
But I give you another story which you like as a newspaper man. Both of you will enjoy this. The largest newspaper in our state is the Manchester Union Leader. Not a paragon of great journalism, but the William Loeb paper. About as, it's a terrible paper. Anyway, and it sure doesn't share a single view with ours. The editor is a guy named Joe McQuaid. And my third year at the foundation, I invited Joe to come and have dinner with the board. We have an annual retreat, and I said, let's start off early talking to Joe about the work we're going to do and see what he thinks of the foundation. And I knew Joe's wife because I'd served with her on a board that Judd Gregg had set up. And she called me about 3 days before our meeting and said, what are you doing with Joe? I said, what do you mean? She said, well, every night after dinner, he goes into his office, and he's got this huge pile of all your annual reports there. He's going through them, drawing lines. Oh, Jesus. So he said, I think I know what it is, and I told a little bit. And then Joe comes to the meeting, and he basically says, well, I prepared for this meeting a bit. And I went back and I looked at 20 years of your reports. And I got to say, you're doing some amazing things in your foundation that we didn't cover. But you are doing some things that I cannot abide, and I did not know you were doing them. So I'm going to offer you a deal, he said. The deal is we could do two things. We could continue to cover you like we do now. You're not a big issue in our life. We don't give you much attention. Or we can give you a lot more attention. And I will give you some wonderful edits. You'll be on the front page a lot. I like the stuff you're doing. But I'm going to nail you on some of the things that I really can't stand. And you have to have both. Which would you like? It took us about 2 seconds to make the call, which was that he could do a lot more damage to us on the downside than he could help on the upside. And so we found a very gracious way to say, we don't want you to cover us as much. You had to find a way to say that. And the result was, then I should say, I supplemented that with, again, the thing you can do in a small state, which is 2 or 3 times a year I would have lunch or dinner with Joe alone. And part of it was to just talk to him as a person. So I wasn't a stereotype. I wasn't that New York liberal Jew up in New Concord. I was a person. And so it made it harder for Joe to dislike me. I couldn't have done that as easily in a big city or in a big state, but I could build the personal connections. But in 25 years, they never once criticized the thing the foundation did.
Sweet Jesus.
Yeah, that's right, sweet Jesus. Now, there were things, I'm sorry, they did criticize some things we did, but never naming us. So they would say, that Pipsqueak paper to the north, meaning the Concord Monitor, has this dumb, stupid idea or something like that, which is an idea we had, but they never mentioned the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. They blamed it on the dumb, stupid paper to the Pipsqueak paper to the north. Nothing to do with, we could have fought that issue, and we didn't fight for it. And it just sort of drifted along. Finally, the state acted on it. We didn't do enough about it, some of the immigration issues. There were a lot of budget issues that we didn't do as much about as we might. We're now involved in what seemed like a fairly simple thing, which is prison reform. It's a good example. In New Hampshire, corrections is now the 3rd largest item in the state budget. And it's not unusual. A lot of states, it's the 3rd, 4th, 5th largest budget item. No one's paying attention to it. Oops, what did I do? Did I push? Okay, good. Less than what I want to do next thing. So, here's this huge budget item, and a budget item growing, because we have so many people doing time in this country, way beyond what should happen. And we checked around quietly, didn't look like there was going to be major opposition to it. And so here's how we proceeded on that. The first thing we did was I went to see the Attorney General, Kelly Ayotte, who's now a Republican senator. But she was the leading Republican law enforcement person in the state. And I knew the governor wouldn't do anything unless he was sure that she wasn't going to attack him from the law enforcement side. So I had to go see her first. And I went to see Kelly, who I had a great relationship with. He said, I'd like to do something on this. I'd like to go to the governor. I don't want to go to him unless would you go with me? And we negotiated in terms of what she would do it. She said, I'll deal with people once they've done terms. I don't want to deal with anything that's going to limit who goes into prison. But once they're there, as terms of who goes out and how quickly, I'll work with you on that. And I'm not ruling out eventually moving back upstream to where people go in, but I don't want to start with that. And we sort of negotiated out a general set of terms, and we agreed that we'd take it to the governor. She and I then went to see the governor, and his first question, literally once I described, Kelly sat there, but his first question, as soon as I finished making the pitch on doing something on this issue, which he understood entirely because of the budget issues, was, where are you, Kelly? Right away turned to her. Once she said, these are the bases on which I do it, he said, we're on. We'll work it out. I can do it. I can go with you on this. And then we then needed help from Washington, and there was a wonderful group that Pew set up that's in Washington. That's a terrific group on criminal justice. And it took us 9 months for them to take our phone call. They kept saying, the secretary, they kept saying, you're so small. They were saying it nicely, but they were saying, we can't deal with you. You're not worth the time. They were dealing with Illinois, Ohio, big states, Kansas, and Texas, and they wouldn't take our call. And finally, in order to get them to come up and see us in New Hampshire, or let us meet with us, they wouldn't even meet with us. If we came down there, we had to get Judd Gregg to call. I mean, this is just to get a meeting. But we seemed so small compared to the other ones, and we had to make our case. And Judd did make the call, and we talked to them, and they were quite impressed. And they said, we'll come up. They came up, and we had, in a single room, we had the leadership of the House, the Senate, the Chief Justice, the Commissioner, the Governor, and so on. Everybody was there. And they said we had never seen all the groups like that waiting for us, our first meetings. And they eventually went with us, and we negotiated with them a sort of a deliberate process by which we could reduce the prison population by 25% over a fixed period of years. A method that they had all the facts. They did the numbers, and they continued. They were very helpful. All the examples they used were from states at least as far right as we were. They used lots of Texas, lots of Kansas examples. So they kept citing those. And they gave names to our people, or people they could talk to in those states, the governor and others there, so that people who were nervous would. And even after doing all that, and we finally went ahead, and they made some substantial grants to us, we matched it. We ended up in the election of 2010 with some really ugly issues brought by the parole and probation staff, who didn't want to lose the jobs, didn't want to lose their standing, and by people who, some elected Republican officials who thought that this was going to compromise safety in the state. And we hadn't seen those coming. We should have known, and we didn't. And we ended up with we had to modify the bill in 3 or 4 places, not in major ways, but we hadn't seen these, and we had to make the compromises. But that's part of the game. And we've now been proceeding fairly well, and they take credit for having saved the opponents take credit for having saved the legislation we improved it. The governor wasn't bad trying to start this, but this is much better, and that's not an unusual process, and that didn't feel like a complete defeat. But there were ones where we actually did get defeated, and ones we didn't try. That was your question, where we
That's your question about that. So your staff is politicized enough that they do not feel contaminated by the compromises of political arrangements. Because staffs I've worked with in foundations tend to be pretty absolutist.
So I think you're being polite. I think what happened was that because the dominant, if you work in an organization, when you see where the dominant wind is blowing, you either leave the organization or you behave. So I think we have people who aren't pleased with it, but it's a cushy job, and they can still do their job of talking to donors, and I don't know what they say, but it's so clearly now the norm of the foundation, honey, that those people who were unhappy just...
And you were there a long time.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it's the value of it. But we've got a handful of staff that are really superb on this stuff, and they take the lead on it. And other staff just don't do much either way. We're still a handful of people can do this. Many people can't. Only a handful can do it because of the sensitivity. So at any one time, there's not a lot of issues going on. And we're using the same people again and again who have good antenna and who get the politics of it. So we gradually tried to add more people to the staff who get it.
Sometime after my second year at night, we were heavily involved in education, and particularly in Florida. And it turned out that Clay Shaw, Republican congressman just up the road, congressman by virtue of the insane way that we carve up congressional districts, but anyway, had decided the fatherhood business was not a bad idea, that he was sort of wanting to do something about, not to penalize runaway fathers, but to try to encourage it. And he was sort of walking along that line, and Ford Foundation was launching an initiative in this field, and I thought, my God, here's a chance to actually do a little bit of loo work here. I mean, I can actually make, Jesus, my staff went, but sir, you want to be with that arch fiend, right-wing dog? And that's one thing. And then second, Ford got very nervous because they got embraced by a lot of sort of right-wing thinkers in this field. And all of a sudden, Ford is walking that dog back as fast as he can. And so I'm sitting here with the staff in revolt. And Clay, of course, himself, being a smart man, looked up one day and said, I don't need to be with anything that the Knight Foundation of Heidi Carter is with. And so that was the end of it. But making that kind of stuff work is really hard. I just want to say again, I find it amazing.
Well, again, it's easier in a smaller state.
Yeah.
You know, you all we're hearing more from people who are part of the foundation field. What does it look like to you who haven't been in it? Do you look at this and say, God, I don't want to go near this field? Or you say, what is it all about? Or this isn't what we thought philanthropy was? Or why are we here?
Well, two of my students
Well, yeah.
last year were here. I don't know if they had any thoughts about it. But, do you think this is unique, strange? Or he's just strange, I You may not have it.
Yeah, I don't want to put you to the spot.
I don't want to
I'd
put
love
you
to.
on the spot.
I don't want you to be intimidated by these guys either.
I mean, I think it's an attractive model. It's definitely a little unique from some of the other foundations we've studied, and that's, of course, lots of all. Yeah, it's intriguing certainly to learn your background and to see how it was embraced. I think the point of having a small state is very interesting, and like you say, I think that certainly added kind of a benefit that maybe other states face.
Let me just run through the lessons.
Sure. Oh, no, I was going to say, do you feel like that you're in the richest state in the nation, and there aren't that many poor people and that many terribly poor people, it gives you a certain luxury to devote your time to other issues that a foundation located in Cleveland, community foundation, just is busy trying to keep people alive and doing public policy is something they just don't have the time for.
Actually, I think Ron, the guy who heads the Cleveland Foundation.
I just use that.
No, no,
That's a
but-
bad example.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bad, but interesting. Ron's the guy who runs it is an extraordinary guy who worked at the CIA for 10 years.
So CIA.
Yeah, so, but he's done some extraordinary public policy stuff, which has infuriated the chamber and other groups like that by going after big economic development projects and using it. He's been negotiating with the Cuban government. He's talked to the State Department about trying to figure out, can I persuade, if we normalize relations with Cuba, we want to make the case that the Cuban mission, whatever it is, beyond the one they have in Washington, they should open in Cleveland, not in Florida, because we're closer to the heartland of business. And we're talking to, we want to go, he was going to go see Raul Castro, last I heard, they talked about it with the State Department. He and I talked a lot about this stuff, so he's doing very risky stuff. And he's a pretty interesting example. One of the lessons that I'm going to get to here is never brag about this stuff. You can't, the hardest thing about this is you can't talk about it. Because no one in public life wants to hear that there's this foundation in there doing all these things. These guys are in there for a living. They're commissioners, they're elected officials, they're career civil servants, and they don't want to look like this outside group dabbling is coming in and mixing it up. So they want you. They're quite happy if you serve meals, if you have discussions with them, that sort of convening kind of stuff. But they don't want you to play yourself in a big policy role. So it's a real trick to find a way to tell your story to your own family and donors. That's a different kind of problem.
Except, of course, Ed Skloot writes a piece for The Atlantic, pointing out that if you're going to give away more money every year than the net of all the foundations in America minus 15, that you get to do an awful lot of beating in your chest. If you're the Gates
That's right.
Foundation, and you're out there.
And how rare was that piece? Have you seen anybody?
No, you see, I read that piece and I said, I didn't tell it. Ed doesn't want to go back to work in the foundation world. But that is the other side of it. If you got enough money and a willingness to beat your chest, you know, people will, you know, they'll take the king's shilling.
But they will, but here's an example. When Patty Stonecipher retired as the CEO of Gates after how many years, the Economist did a 2-page interview with her, which was rare to begin with, but it shows who Gates is. And in the interview, one of the questions were, what's the biggest change in your time at the foundation? And she said, when Bill and Melinda and I started this foundation, we were programs. We were smart programs. And we figured we'll just put the goddamn best idea out on the floor, and we had the money to back it, and we'll move everything in front of us. And she said, in those days, if Bono had called us, well, she said, first of all, none of us knew who Bono was. But had he called us, we would never have taken his call. Why would we talk to him? Now, we realize when he calls, drop everything. Because we can't do it just with our money and our smart ideas. We have to have people like him who make the calls, do the connections, move international organizations. And we can't do it. She's now, I'm happy to admit, he's much more powerful than we are. We need him. But as he said, when he first, at the beginning, we didn't even know who he was. And I thought that was a pretty interesting way to say that even with that power and money, it matters. So let me just go through these lessons quick. I think I've covered most of them. Okay, so let me do the first one. First one is public policy is a continuum. It's not an on or off switch, but more like a dimmer. It's not as if you do or don't do public policy. As I say to my peers in the private room, you're always doing it. Who you chose to make a grant to, a Head Start Center or someone, it's a little bit of public policy. So you're not making a huge change, one step at a time like that. And think of it like a dimmer switch. You make it on and off rather than on, off. Public policy, not public policy. Second, I made this point before, don't talk about it. Third, go slowly. Don't do what I did. You know, don't now getting the governor the first step out the door. Find a way, and slowly get the issue bigger and bigger. Corrections is a good example. Now that we're into corrections, we're using to expand that into mental health and into drugs. Where we built the base in one, we built the following. We're using that to step out into related areas because a lot of people who are doing time in prison are dual diagnosis, so we need to get into them. Instead of going directly into mental health, we're doing it through the corrections as a way to do it.
Well, let me stop you for a second on the second point. I know this is, in a way, we're all in the game and inside baseball, but in the world of philanthropy, a fair number of people, led by folks like Gary LaMarche, who used to be at the Atlantic Foundation, and so on, say that advocacy is our right. We should be doing it. We should be doing it really publicly. When I was in the foundation, I would say, you know, open your mouth and make your ways felt. Otherwise, who's going to know? And so, in my experience, because you're shifting some of my views, perhaps, I saw the philanthropic job as wedded to the issue of advocacy. Without that, and just sprinkling your money, that's not going to do so much. And yet, I sort of hear you saying you can advocate, but don't be very public about your advocacy, which I can interpret as saying, hey, it's playing in the back room again. Lou's become one of the boys, and he's doing it that way, and leaving his constituency behind. I don't mean this personally, but you get the point I'm making.
I think it's a great point, and I think the difference there is between a big private foundation like yours or like Gary's, where you don't have, you're not vulnerable the way we were. We're vulnerable because we're on all the pluses we had of being on the ground and building a base also means that we could lose our following. We needed people to keep giving us money. A lot of our money still comes from some of the major Republican figures in the state. I can't offend them because once someone you lose someone. It takes much longer to get them and their friends back. So I don't want language that's alarming to them. You can do it, and in fact, I'm better off having you do it, and better off having Garrett do it, or having Ford or someone like that. They don't do it, but they would. That helps, but then you're not vulnerable, except you may be an audit. But,
No, really good answer, because I think that covers it very, very well. And I think of Bill Gates, and you know, you go to Davos, and there's Bill and Melinda, in every, you know, they're setting up the meetings and the people who want to meet them, and it's generally a one-way conversation, though people who want to meet them don't know it. Bill is telling him what he wants, and it's really, he takes advocacy to a fine point.
well, there's the front page story in the Times, below the fold, but still a 2-column story, talking about all the money they're spending on advocacy, quite openly. And there was little, I didn't see much opposition to that. It was quite amazing to have millions and millions of dollars in which Gates is spending on advocacy around public education. It was great.
Actually, billions.
Billions.
Billions. It's one of those things.
All their opponents are on their payroll.
That's right.
Yeah, well, they're not making the old Ford mistake. That is, they, I keep waiting, actually, for a populist backlash, right-wing as well as left, against this use of massive, unresponsive money. And that kind of, but you just went to a good reason why they're not going to be there soon, is they make damn sure that they've got a spectrum.
Because you could look at that money, just like the Citizens United in Philanthropy. It's a few
Yes,
wealthy
you
people
can.
who are doing it.
And Ed was too discreet to use that notional thing. I think it was probably before Citizens United came down.
Yeah, but the world is changing very fast.
But I think that one of the differences is you're being an advocate rather than talking about being an
That's
advocate.
right.
Yes.
And I'm involved in retail philanthropy. I can't talk about advocacy, but I can be an advocate. And it's knowing how to find that space and stay in it.
That's really
That's the difference, yes.
So do you have any competition?
That helps. That's a great one. Well, the biggest competition we have is Fidelity, plus all the private money managers. And people deciding their money could be more effectively spent investing for charitable purposes there with private money managers. One of the big things that I even talk about here is, which we haven't been as creative as some people, is to use our assets differently, not just the income from them, but invest the assets. So we have $500 million, but we're only putting 50 into the game, but we've got another 450 we could use to invest in trying to, and some of our peers have done a smart work with that. We've also been very active in courting high-tech people, because we're trying to get the younger people involved. And we have them now, when they create a company, signing on, making commitments, futures of their, when the terms are wrong.
IPO.
When they IPO, they've already committed their futures to us, and then when they IPO, we get some of the money. They're doing that, Groupworks, they're doing all the work themselves. And this came out of an idea that Peter O'Hara did in Silicon Valley. He has this great description of someone coming to him with an idea, a guy Peter hadn't met before, and he said, I'm creating a company, we're going to market all kinds of things to be able to use the web to market things. And I'm going to create a market. Do you know what it is? It's the word. What? I've forgotten the word. It's, you all know what it is. Media art. What's the company?
eBay.
eBay, right. It's like, I'm going blank here, but he didn't know, he'd never met him before. I mean, I've got this idea for something, I'm going to do this. And Peter said, okay, fine. He said, but and Peter said, I don't have any money to give you now, but I think we're going to be successful. So I'm going to make a commitment of a certain number of shares when we IPO. He said, okay, fine. $43 million when it IPO'd. And so we've been trying to do that with all the young high-tech people in the state to get them involved. Let me just right issue. Big point. This is not a needs analysis on the issue you're going to pick. There's 40 issues you can pick at any one time. Don't go through this complicated, which is a higher value. We're dealing with kids' education or affordable housing or cleaning the environment. screw it, excuse me, pick the one where it meets the other tests, where you have political partners and things like that. Don't go through a careful calibration on what the greatest needs are, in that sense. Third rail bad, don't pick the bad issues, of course. Look for, this is a really useful idea. Think of issues as one where you want to catch them before the sun comes up over the horizon, before the leadership is taking positions. Once they've taken positions, it's much harder to get elected officials to change. They've taken a position on it. So you're doing much better if you can catch an issue just as they're starting to think about it, but before they've committed. That's just a common sense idea. It's much harder once they're publicly lit. Strong partners, we've never done anything by ourselves. We can't do it without the others. We're nobody without it. And if I have to pick a bottom line, it's this one, relationship, it's all about that. You can never win on the merits. It's not as if those of us who, like left-brain people like me, think we just tell them our case, we'll win. They'll carry over for it. No way, Charlie. Social capital matters big time. It's about trust, build the ties, work with people. And start now in the off-season. You work with people. My ability to go to Kelly on the corrections thing depended on 4 years of prior work with him. I wasn't asking for anything those 4 years. I didn't say, I'm doing this now because for 4 years I'm going to ask you to back me on corrections. You say, this is a smart person. She's got clout. Somewhere along the line, it'll be important. So you spend the time seeing them again and again and again. And then when you need them, you know them already. And this is what I tried to say in my speech title. Money was never determined for us in the issue. Last few. We want to know the law, and we never want to have to argue. Once we have to argue the law publicly, we're in trouble. So we want to make sure we're within the law, but you never want to have to make the case if you can avoid it. And these are the points about staff and board, about recruiting, creating culture, structure. I said, make this work. And this last one, I'm not sure everybody knows what the do line is. It's an old Eisenhower term, the distant early warning system. Because when something goes bad, you may not know it all the time. You got to be out there circulating among people all the time. So if something hit a storm, if you really offended someone, if they're furious, they may not even call you and tell you. You just never get another penny from them. And they're telling their friends and their counsels. So you're constantly, and this is where your question about the staff culture goes, because if we've got a staff out talking to lots of people, we need them to come back in and say, you know, so-and-so was really heated what you did, or you got to talk to so-and-so. And they're not going to tell us. So, and finally, don't crow about it. I think that's it. So, if anybody wants to know more, this is the senior person at the Charitable Foundation now, who's the person who's doing a lot of stuff. She and the president, my successor. They're good to talk to about it.
Any more questions, any thoughts, any critiques? Yes.
Louis, I would like to compare you briefly to the man who spoke a few weeks ago, because it's interesting to me to come in and to hear these two. You're completely different from him for this reason. He spoke about where his dollars went and what good they did and where they were dedicated. You've never mentioned a dollar and where it went. You've talked about advocacy and the things you're trying to do, want to do, hope to do, but what did you do? Where did the money go? Who did it help? What happened to it, if you would tell us?
You're talking about
You have about 25 million. 5% of 500 million would be about 25 million a year to spend, or so. I don't know.
Your predecessor was Gene Cochran from Duke Charitable.
Right. We do tell those stories, but unfortunately, they rarely touch on these issues for the reasons I said. Boy, these are not big financial expenditures, but they're chewing up maybe 70% of my time when I was there. And for the reasons I said before, it's often very hard to say we played a major role in. We can say these are issues we worked on, and the state's improved, it's reduced its prison population by this, so we protected so many acres of land the state has. But rarely can we, do we crow too much about that. It's a dilemma.
Well, where do your, if a majority of your money is in one form of designated fund pockets or another, where does that money go? It's part of the same question. But
What I would do is if I go back to the very first chart, can I start this? This one here, we could easily talk about where the bulk of the money goes under fund and where that went. That doesn't cover most of the stuff here. But we could tell a good story, thank you. We could tell a good story about where that money goes. It's not that grant making is bad that we do. I think it's quite good. And it lends itself to telling a story, but it doesn't have nearly, it's not what's made us most significant. It's not us at the highest and best.
Where does it go? Most of it go to education? Does most of it
No,
go
it's New Hampshire. It's the land. It's the environment. It's the green. Yankees, they don't like the people much, but they're big up in the land. I mean, there are, there's always some stories you profile a lot of it. And there too, we learn that the big pop doesn't come from an aggregate where you say this is where the money goes. You do much better with a small story. And so each week we're on the radio, public radio, every week for 2 minutes, a joint program with public radio, which they underwrite, in which we feature a different nonprofit. And we don't talk about them. We have a wonderful journalist who works on this with us, and she always says, don't tell me how they scream. I want to hear them scream. And she helps us script it. And so it's people talking about in one little town or another what they're doing, and that gives people a sense of it.
Oh, and you guys invented the internet too. Yeah. Sorry. Other thoughts? Other questions? Yes, please.
I have a question. It's sort of a devil's advocate kind of question.
Good.
But I've been thinking a lot about the intersection between philanthropy and democracy. And I understand that community foundations, I guess they represent the view of people a little bit more because it's a bunch of different people investing in this foundation, whereas a private foundation is typically established by one or a small number of donors that have a large amount of money. And I've just been thinking about foundations' ability to change and shape the political rhetoric around certain issues, and to perhaps, set the political agenda within a certain state, or just thinking about the Koch brothers and the Mercator Center and their ability to change the national political rhetoric. And you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that there are a few foundations that are hesitant to engage in politics because they feel it's somehow immoral, perhaps having to do with this question of democracy and politics and all of that. And I was wondering, in your experience in advocating, have you employed any tactics to sort of mitigate the potentially negative effects against, democracy in New Hampshire? Because if you're advocating for something that is not necessarily the will of the people, and you, as a community foundation, have the ability to get that policy passed against the will of the people, or I don't know, I guess asking how do you see that? Do you think that there's a sort of conflict between advocacy, foundational advocacy, and democracy?
Did you say you were a first-year student?
I'm a senior.
Senior.
Wow.
Oh, you're going to the MPP program?
You're being repeated.
Think about it. Think about it. It's a terrific question, phrase, well, but
It's a wonderful question, and I don't think we see ourselves always as a vehicle for the majority will. I don't think the beauty of philanthropy in America is that you don't need a majority. You don't need 51% of the people to do what you're going to do. Just like, unlike a business, you don't need to make a profit to do it either. That's the way the country's set up. And so one of the downside risks is that you'll have someone who seems somewhat privileged because of the money and the tax laws allowed to make their case for something that a majority don't share. The belief would be that the country is better off having all those voices out there and creating a vehicle for minority viewpoints to be heard. Not always minority, but they don't prove they have a majority. Sometimes they're things which ultimately become the majority. We were an advocate for quite a while on gay marriage, for example, before it became, but when it first started, I don't think it was a majority view. now it's becoming that. But the civil rights movement was marked by people who fought for forced majority. But, you know, there are probably things that, I'm sure there are things that we and others have championed that don't have a majority of public view. Therefore, if it was subjected to a vote of the majority, we wouldn't carry it. But does it trouble you to have a vehicle in the country that allows that?
I mean, honestly, yes. Yeah, it kind of does, just because, just thinking about it, the people who are able to contribute to foundations tend to be wealthier. And if these foundations have the ability to shape a political rhetoric, then naturally the rhetoric is going to represent the views of the wealthy majority. Yeah, honestly, yeah, I don't know, it presents sort of a moral quandary for me, because I do agree that foundations can do wonderful things. But whether things that they're doing are good or bad, or whether the things they're doing are in line with my view or against my view, the fact that these organizations have the ability to shape the political rhetoric nationally, like, presents a problem for me.
I think it's a great challenge for this course and for this country on how we balance that. I don't have any more expertise of the rightness of that than anyone else. Someone else want to weigh in?
I would say this, it's a double-edged sword. And there are many ways to look at it, and this is one way. That you can have philanthropic action on the right, if you will just call it that, or on the left, and you have them in both. And that kind of quiet or loud advocacy goes on all the time. Philanthropy is one player among many. It does represent wealth, and boards of foundations are rarely have on their boards representation of the poor, minority groups, and so on. A diversity issue that philanthropy never wants to take up seriously. There are other components of this besides just the democratic one, and how you would peel it off to get to what really counts in the foundation. So issues of who represents what on the board is a very significant question. And the second one, and there are many, but a second one is that foundations are in the game for the long run, usually. And as a result, sometimes their actions, whether you agree or disagree, are important because they can put a stake in the ground and keep working it, whereas others will go away. In the early years that I was in the field, before I got in the field, the Ford Foundation was very active in supporting community organizations and community organizing. Very uncharacteristic for the Ford Foundation, but they had a very strong record.
It was called Camelot.
It was Camelot.
It lasted about 10 years.
Yeah, it lasted 10, 15 years. But they did it, and they still support the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, and the Mexican American, all those things that you wouldn't think that the Ford Foundation or a major foundation would support. They went out of character, and it's lasted quite a while. On the other hand, you've got other foundations, and I'll just use this as another example. I was at a meeting some years ago where the think tanks of the right wing, funded by right-wing philanthropy, were getting together to celebrate how their longevity in making issues become part of the public discourse were taking hold or took hold. And so they used the example of changing welfare reform and making welfare, in their view, happen. One fellow got up from the Heritage Foundation and said, this has got to be 10 years ago I was at it. He said, in 2015, we will change the Social Security system. And that man's had a 15-year view on what they were going to do to change it. So I just, to make an additional point, not quite on the democracy issue, but democracy can come and go, and people will be our points of view. And funders can be in it for the long term. And those who are often have a pretty big impact. I just leave it at that. It's a great question. I think it's for the whole semester. Yeah.
Another way of sort of coming at that would be to say that the real power of the foundation is not necessarily to make a decision despite the democratic process, but to set the agenda by which the democratic process ends. It's like the authority of college president is not to mandate, tell the faculty what to do, but to tell the ways that we're talking about. And that, in a sense, is the whole success of the Occupy movement so far. It's changed the nature of the conversation. So, in the case of Gates and education, they're just overpowering everybody and running like a bulldozer through education policy. But another way areas it may be that it's more setting up an agenda, shaping an agenda, which then various democratic forces, conservative, liberal, whatever, and then become engaged.
It's one of the hardest questions that ever confronts anybody who has a vehicle of power which is not necessarily responsive to, quote, the democratic impulse. But, of course, that's the way this country was established. I mean, there is a very strong current established the constitutional principle, but also a practice that today's democracy, that is to say today's majority, is not to be trusted any more than the concentration of power in a few hands is to be trusted. I mean, and that if you left everything up to today's democratic impulse, you know, at least in my home state, I would bet you we'd still have segregation pretty thoroughly ensconced.
You'd still have slavery.
And but I mean, it's an old, you know, again, this is private enterprise in this country on newspapers, and God knows they run it right into the ground. But editorial positions of newspapers often were as lousy and namby-pamby as any foundation ever dreamed of being. But those who were vigorous, you know, were constantly being told, you don't represent the democratic instinct. You are trying to tell us what to do. You are running over majority opinion. You are in violation of the community, you know, whatever, when it happened. To which my answer would be, you're damn right. I hope so. I am not prepared to tell you that today's democratic majority is the one which ought to be enshrined forever, and that there's got to be alternative voices speaking. Problem, of course, and where you are become almost impossible to deal with your question, there's no damn guarantee that the average foundation executive will not be reflecting this democratic majority of the moment, that there will be enough dissent across the board in all these enshrined centers of power to make some countervailing power, which is another notional thing I grew up believing in, enough countervailing voices that you have a real debate. And whether that exists is more important to me than whether the power exists, but whether there's enough people going at each other from these positions of power from quite different points of view. That worries me a lot. And I'm just a long statement saying it's a hard question, and it's not an easy answer, you know, to it.
Do you want to register for the MPD program? Be very good. Is there one more question? We're at break time, and I don't want to go over. Anybody else have a final thought or perspective? If not, on behalf of you, I would like to thank Lou.